2025 is upon us, and it looks to be a promising year for camera releases. So this is a list of my top 5 cameras that I'm most anticipating coming in 2025. So starting off this list at number 5, I have the Nikon Z9 Mark II. The reason that I have it on the list is because, well, this is the next step to see what Nikon has to offer. Have they been working on a camera that is going to revolutionize the industry now that they have the tech coming from Red? Or are they going to kind of play it safe like I feel like Canon did with the R1, along with Sony with the A7 Mark II? The Z9 really has a golden opportunity to push things forward and leapfrog the competition and to be ahead for the next few years. But we will have to see if they decide to take that route or if they kind of play it safe. The reason that I have it at number 5 and not further along in this list is because we're not entirely sure that this camera will be coming in 2025. And even if it does, this is going to be a very niche camera. It will probably be a very hefty body coming in with a hefty price tag, and not many people will have the funds or the access to this camera. What excites me about it, even though it's not a camera that more than likely I will buy, is that it should show the tech that Nikon is working with and what we will see coming up in the future in newer releases. Moving on to number 4 on this list, I have the Canon R7 Mark III. Now this is a camera that pretty much all the rumors are pointing that this will be coming out this year. I don't truly believe that we have any reliable specs that have been leaked for this camera just yet, but speculating, I do see this being a more revolutionary camera than, well, the R7 Mark II was. I felt like that was very much an incremental upgrade. It had some cosmetic features. It did have a new sensor, but it wasn't nothing spectacular about it. Although that was just a 2-year cycle update, and the opportunity that I see Canon having is they do have the sensor from the R3, and the sensor from the R3 is a very, very incredible sensor. It's very fast, and it's honestly so fast that it keeps up with the R1 in a lot of different ways. And if they are comfortable enough to bring that sensor to the R7 Mark III, then I think it will be the fastest sensor of any of those cameras in that lower end prosumer range, and I think a lot of people would be very excited about it. Moving on to number 3 is the Sony A7 V. This is a camera that maybe will outsell all the other cameras on this list, or is likely to be up there for the coming year. The A7 IV was a very successful monetarily camera, and the A7 III was completely above and beyond what anybody had in that price range at that time. And I feel like the reason that I'm a little bit apprehensive to move it further along on this list is because, to me, the A7 IV, although very successful, was not nearly as exciting as I hoped that it would be. The A7 III, when it came out, was just such a revolutionary camera. It almost stepped on the toes of the A7 R3 that had just came out and the A7S II that was out before it. It really didn't necessarily pay attention to those cameras, even though it was cheaper. They just like threw the kitchen sink at it, and a lot of people praised Sony for that type of mentality. But when it comes to the A7 IV, it seems like they played it a lot safer. Absolutely, there was a lot of upgrades. The sensor was, I think, a 33 megapixel sensor up from 24, but it was a very slow sensor. It had a lot of rolling shutter issues. I thought for sure that they could have full frame 4K 60 in that camera, but they decided to do a crop for the 4K 60. And I thought that was a little bit too conservative, especially considering the A7S III and the FX3, which they seem to be trying to protect. It had full frame 120, so I thought for sure they would have at least full frame 4K 60.
Where was this plane going? Where did it come from? Why was it fucking up my video? Why is my inner dialogue British?
Now, of course, the ergonomics and autofocus were much better, but if I'm not mistaken, it wasn't much faster of a camera. I think it only shoots 10 frames per second in compressed RAW, I believe. And if you move it to uncompressed RAW, I think it drops down to like 8 or 6 frames per second, which is a big step down from what Canon is doing with the R6 Mark I and II, I think are somewhere around 20 frames per second. So it was a much slower camera, even though it had a slightly higher megapixel count. To me, it didn't really deliver on what I thought that line was going to produce. And that is the reason why I am apprehensive to put the A7 V much further. But I am thinking, since Canon has been so strong with competition, and now you have the Nikon Z9 Mark III that has made waves in a lot of different ways, I hope that it will light a fire underneath Sony for them to take it to the next level, but we will just have to wait and see. Now, coming at number 2 on this list is a camera that, well, generally speaking, I wouldn't be super excited about because it is an APS-C camera. I prefer the full frame look, and I don't necessarily anticipate getting an APS-C camera, but I do know a lot of people, especially in the wildlife and sports photography, really love APS-C cameras. And I really think this may be something very special. And that would be the Canon R7 Mark II, or it's possibly a newer version of an APS-C camera like an R4 or something like that. It may have a new naming scheme, I'm not entirely sure, but we're hearing rumors, and to me it makes a lot of logical sense for them to bring this camera out as having their first global shutter camera. It would be much easier for them to have the processing power to run a global shutter on an APS-C sensor, as well as it will not be stepping on the toes of the recently released R1, because you could say, well, the R1 is a full frame camera and it has different reasons for being what it is. Sorry if the wind's bad. I'm like halfway blocking it here. I don't know if it's working. I have a wind muff, but I'm like using my hand at this point. Looks goofy. They will definitely be able to differentiate it from the R1 because they can say, well, the R1 is full frame and we wanted the best of the best image quality coming out of the R1 and we didn't want to have any degradation. But with the R7, with the APS-C sensor, they may be slightly more forgiven to have a bit of degradation because it's not necessarily a flagship. But it could be an extremely impressive camera. Having a global shutter for wildlife will be an absolute game changer for a lot of people. And it will also be a camera that is unlike anything else on the market and unlike anything that I see any other camera manufacturers doing anytime soon. So even though it's not going to be a camera for me, I have enough people who watch this channel that I know will be super excited about it. And I'm very interested to see where Canon pushes this tech. And I'm always a fan of better and greater tech coming along that pushes the whole camera industry forward. And that for me is why it's number 2 on this list. Now, coming in at number 1 is a camera that maybe not everybody will agree with, but it's definitely the one I'm most excited to see something from. And that is the Sony FX3 Mark II, or maybe a Sony A7 IV. They're kind of like brother-sister cameras. It's interesting. Not sure if they're really going to keep the S line. That's why I'm saying the FX3 Mark II. But generally speaking, over the last 4 years, many of Sony's cameras have used that same sensor from the A7S III. When the A7S III came out, it was universally praised, so much so that very soon after it was put into a cinema style camera like the FX3, and then used again in the future with the ZV-1. So it's been a very reliable, well-used sensor. The FX3 was also used in a theatrical release that came out. I forget the name of the movie. I'll probably like flash it here, but it's very exciting to think that a camera that a lot of people can somewhat afford is good enough for a major Hollywood production. Now, I think that Sony has a whole lot of opportunities ahead of them if they decide to push things to the next level. Now, the A7S III and the FX3 already had basically the fastest frame rates that is completely read out the full sensor without doing any kind of pixel binning with 4K 120. They had great dynamic range. They didn't have really any overheating issues. So they're already a great camera, but some of the things that they could definitely improve at this point is maybe raising up the megapixel count a little bit. I foresee maybe a 24 megapixels bringing in 6K, because I think with some of the newer sensor technology that they've released for phones, which supposedly brings in almost double the light saturation, you could essentially get the low light performance of the FX3 with a 26 megapixel sensor. So you can get higher resolution along with the same low light performance, which would be absolutely impressive on its own. The other thing that I really hope that they add is maybe internal ND filters. That's something that I think a cinema camera should absolutely have. More cinema features like open gate would be very much appreciated. A more robust, clearer to read screen with different exposure tools like scopes and even false color would be a great addition. So there's a lot of things that they could add to this camera that I would be very excited about. Of course, adding faster frame rates would be great if you can do like 4K, downsampled 4K 240 or 1080 at like 400 and something. I don't know if they will push it that far, but even if they don't do any of that and they just bring a lot more cinema features to this camera, I think it could be a great addition to the Sony line. And personally, it is the reason that I'm most excited to see this camera come out. But that's just my list. Drop in the comment section below and give me yours. Is mine completely crazy? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know all that in the comments below. Consider subscribing. It helps out a channel like mine that is smaller, and I would greatly appreciate it. Until next time, peace.